We live in a world that is siloed. We exist in policy echo chambers, platforms that validate us and not challenge our beliefs. As an African living in Africa, I buy Chinese phones, I use American software, I protect my data based on European GDPR laws. In Africa, iPhone's market share stands at 14.18% compared to 55% in the United States and 35% in Europe, falling way below the global average of 27%. Smartphone shipments in the Middle East and Africa increased 1% year over year and 7% quarter over quarter in Q2 2023, with Apple's shipments rising by 75% year over year in the region. A comparative analysis by Canalys places Samsung's market share at 33%, Xiaomi at 6%, and Realme at 3%. This data is important because notably, Realme recorded a substantial 71% annual growth rate by November 2022. I say this because when you compare the numbers across the globe, you see that the world is a mix of different things. And today I want us to talk about joining the dots. What is considered valuable in Africa is very different in Estonia, Washington, D.C., and even Dubai. I want to share with you a story. A few months ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and I asked for a safe to keep my valuables. And so the hotel asked me, what valuables do you have? And I said, a laptop, a phone, an iPad. And they said, that's not a valuable. You don't need a safe for that. But I come from Africa, where a phone is valuable. You get robbed on the streets and they take your phone. Even in London, people get robbed of their phones and there's a market for it. You know, in Malawi, in Kenya, in different parts of Africa. And that tells us that what's valuable in one part of the world really may not be valuable in another part of the world. Similarly, there's a push to specialize, even in technology policy. But we are learning that specialization may be problematic when we do not connect the dots. This brings in more red tape, lack of contextual and geographic understanding. And I want you to consider the following scenarios. We grapple with keeping big tech accountable, but do not see why we should fund startups and offer incentives for their growth. And two, we deny professionals visas and wonder why we are not winning the AI race as a first world country. And I want to show you that between 2018 and April 2023, 59% of English-speaking Africans and 74% of French-speaking Africans were denied visas. In 2022, 62% of English-speaking African applicants and 66% of others were also rejected. Those are really high numbers, and those are people that could go abroad and change the trajectory of these particular countries. And number three, we have dilapidated schools with no electricity in Africa. In Burkina Faso, for instance, and Cameroon, Malawi, and Niger alone, over 80% of primary schools lack access to electricity. Around half of these primary schools in sub-Saharan Africa are without electricity, according to a 2023 UNESCO study. So when we use these same schools as polling stations during elections, you wonder, how do you balance infrastructure and education, especially electoral infrastructure? The ballot box will get to the remotest ends of the country, but examination papers and food will not arrive at these same locations. Is that an oxymoron? And four, we lock out civil society organizations from tech policy conversations and wonder why emerging technologies have no safeguards, guardrails, and consumer protection mechanisms. Who then keeps these people accountable other than civil society? An analysis of the just concluded AI Safety Summit in the UK indicates that out of all the invited organizations, half of the industry representation is from the United States, and over half of them are big tech companies. So over 100 civil society groups have signed an AI Summit open letter, challenging the closed-door approach, sidelining communities and workers that are most affected by artificial intelligence. In my home country, Kenya, the digital identity journey took over 5 years to implement because the government did not bring civil society to the table way before this process began. And we see Uganda making similar mistakes in their digital identity journey. And finally, we struggle with diversity, but technically lock out those that should be in the room. For instance, in 2019, Canada hosted the Black in AI Summit, but many Black people could not attend, including AI professors from across Africa, including Zimbabwe. 24 researchers, most from Africa, who were supposed to participate in a Black and AI workshop at the conference, had their visas refused, according to the workshop organizer, Victor Silva. While visas were granted to over 10 applicants from Africa, more than 70 applications remained pending just weeks before the conference was set to commence. So why are we not joining the dots between data, infrastructure, talent, and also equity, and seeing ways in which you could join these particular dots? And I want to provide a few solutions. At the Lawyers Hub, we've been working at the intersection of law and technology and looking at ways in which you could fix these dots and connect these dots to ensure that the world progresses, especially in terms of data equity. And I want to put forward some solutions to think about today. The first one is, can we think of connecting institutional dots? What happens to the data protection officers? Do they become AI regulatory bodies? Who represents governments at digital trade negotiations? Is it the ICT minister or the Minister of Trade? Does the world need a global AI body to coordinate data governance? And did we need a global cybersecurity body? And so we see that this silent tussle for power and institutions prevents progress. There is a need to join the dots at the institutional level. Secondly, the infrastructure dots. How do we solve the digital public infrastructure and access to public data sets? How do we invest in this? The United Nations has declared digital public infrastructure a high impact initiative for 2023. I believe there's a need to connect the electricity that we're talking about, data centers that we're talking about, and also data as a public good. That would be useful to connect this dot. And three, we must connect the data dots. We must look at data as a building block for representative and inclusive AI. Despite its challenges, they have said that AI has the potential to promote unprecedented equity of outcomes amongst communities, especially for communities that are underrepresented. Without a thoughtful approach to how AI systems are designed, assessed, and governed, there will be risks that will magnify these problems and present just present-day privileges that separate the haves and the have-nots in terms of data. So how can this be prevented? And how do we ensure that communities can reap the benefits of the AI revolution? Neil Sahota, who's an AI advisor to the United Nations, emphasized that companies are unlikely to allocate an extra $10 million to rectify any biases that may affect only a small number of individuals. He stated that companies aren't going to pump an extra 10 million to strip out an extra bias or two that might impact 100 or 200 people. But we need everyone on board, including those 100 people or 200 people. How do we cure for bias? And how do we ensure that there's ideally resources going into data, and this is data that is representative of society? From what I see is that technology pushes us to like the new shiny toys. I think as a society we must resist the urge to newness. We must take a step back and build on the old normative frameworks that govern data, including international human rights frameworks that promote data equity and give agency to people. Steve Jobs once said this: you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, your destiny, life, whatever. This approach has not let me down. And those are the words of Steve Jobs. But also closer back home, Desmond Tutu said that we learn from history, that we don't learn from history. We don't see the culmination of the segregation around slavery, the haves and the have-nots. What we must do about data, and how do we prevent AI from perpetuating these widening gaps in society? And I want to conclude by these particular solutions. We must identify marginalized communities in the data realm. We also must encourage indigenous data and AI solutions, that it's not just about the West, it's about the world. We must also promote inclusivity in those that are developing these particular systems, in data collectors, in data labelers, as well as in artificial intelligence. We also must provide support and maintenance for these teams. We've seen the need for mental health support, especially for people who are going online and doing the hard work of content moderation. You know, cases in Kenya have come up about those that are doing content moderation and needing mental health support. The world must pay attention to this particular society. We also must ensure data representation. Data must look like us. It must be diverse, it must be inclusive, but then also it must be black, it must be white. We must prioritize accessibility and ensure that everybody is on board. And finally, we must adopt a fairness framework, because then when data is fair, new technologies and emerging technologies then become fair. I would want to make my last comment and talk about Desmond Tutu. He said this: there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. I hope that as pertaining to data, that we'll go upstream and find out where we are failing. Thank you.